Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Billy Taylor, the Artistic Director of the Jazz at Kennedy Center. I'd like to welcome you to the Mary Lou Williams Women in Jazz Festival. This has been really something that I've thought about for a long time, and I'm delighted that you are participating and that we have all of these wonderful people on the panel. I'd like to introduce to you our panel members. Antoinette Handy is the former director of the NEA music program. She's an author, wonderful musician, and she has done much more for jazz than many people who are in the business and many people who are outside of the business really know. She has done, in her tenure at the National Endowment, she was able to focus a lot of monies that went to specific jazz, some of the educational programs, because she is an educator, and many of the things that were happening along those lines are directly traceable to this very fine musician. I was about to say, Dr. Dan Morgenstern is director of the Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers University, and they just have a new facility. It's one of the best resources that we find in the Northeast, I can say. I don't know about other places because I use them a lot for the things that I do in all of my research for the various projects that I try to put together, this one and others. And they've been very, very helpful, and they are a resource that if you haven't checked them out, I would hope that you would do that, because they have a new facility and it's wonderful, and they're in good hands under Morgenstern. The lady on my far right is a very fine author, and she has a book which really is dealing a lot with the very subject that we are here to discuss, women in jazz. And if you haven't read it, I hope you'll get it and get a lot of information that you probably would not get from other places. This lady on my immediate right has one of the finest voices that I've ever heard and or accompanied. She's a very fine bassist. She worked with her own groups and many of the groups in New York, including the International Sweethearts of Jazz, and she's done so many things that these are just sketches, because I'm going to ask specific questions that hopefully will enlighten you a lot more as to the wonderful things that all of these people have done. I saved the gentleman on my left for the last because he, of all of us, was closest to Mary Lou Williams. I mean, he knew her better than any of us. He spent more time with her. He's devoted a good bit of his life to making sure that all of us appreciate this wonderful talent that was among us for too short a time. Mary Lou Williams was unique in many ways, but rather than tell you any anecdotal things or any personal references, I'll defer to a gentleman who I think was extremely close to her and has been helping all of us really focus on the truth as far as her compositions, the kind of contribution that she made as an artist. This is Father O'Brien, Peter O'Brien. So I'd like to turn to you first, Father O'Brien, and ask you just to say a few words about Mary Lou to kind of get us started in this. Knowing her as you did, what do you think her main contributions were as a musician first?
Music. I'll tell you about how I met her. I was a seminarian upstate, maybe 50 or 90 miles from New York, and I read an article in Time magazine about two women in music. This would be in February of 1964. It was about Sarah Caldwell, the opera, you say impresaria,
Right.
But she built a whole company, conducted, resurrected operas, and I think they called her the diligent one. I'm not sure, can't remember. It was a double article on music in Time. The second was Mary Lou Williams, the prayerful one, they called her. There were two photographs. Mary Lou Williams praying and kneeling at the communion rail of St. Francis Xavier Church on 16th Street in New York, where I went to high school. I graduated in '58, 6 years before this photograph. And the other was Mary Lou at the piano inside the big oval bar at the Hickory House on 52nd Street. This was exactly right for me. All right, so fairly recent Catholic convert, had written a cantata in honor of Martin de Porres, the first black that the church canonized in 1962. And then a great artist, just right. I was looking for a life. I didn't know I was looking for a life, but I was looking for a life. So I sneaked down to New York somehow. I think I was going to graduate school and didn't go back up there, you know, and I went in and I met Mary. She didn't say anything to me much. I'd written her. Anyway, I sat at that bar. It was a great big bar, big enough to hold a quintet inside of it. Big piano, bass, drums in the back. Mary's right there. And she played. The last tune was Grand Night for Swingin'. The second last tune was 45-degree angle, fast, very good, with a terrific figure near the beginning of it, by Denzel Best. The one before that was the one that got me. And I said to her quietly, what was that? And she said that was just a blues. Later on, she made a big deal out of that all the time. I mean, the blues, the blues, the blues, the blues. That music was like, this is your question, that music kind of poured out of that piano. Popsy Whitaker was a great editor at the New Yorker, and he kind of sneaky and sly too, and he did all those little squibs at the front, and he said, Mary Lou Williams piano from whom so many blessings flow. Metaphor from two different, you know. And that's exactly like right at the edge of a waterfall where that water goes over. Heavy, strong, and that transformed my life. So that music just came at me. It just came at me. It was full, deep, something like that. So the contribution that may last are the records, thank God for recording, which will preserve her insofar as it did get her as a pianist and a performer, some videotape, some film. But I think maybe the core of it is the composer, maybe. Maybe. And we can talk about that. The last thing I'd say is how she died. How do I do this? This gets into the preacher bag, you know. She really did it, that's all. And the only word that comes into my mind, Dan was down there shortly before she died. He came to visit her. And that's, sorry. She never ran towards self-pity, never. Clear as a bell to me. So there was no feeling sorry for herself ever about anything, and she really handled that. And I suppose you could say she was courageous. So she died. You see what I mean? She didn't die. Just like anything else that I ever saw. She'd get furious, she'd get hurt. She'd had a lot of worry. There was fear, but she never felt sorry for herself. So, enough out of me.
Dan, as a historian, what were your reflections on Mary Lou?
Well, it's often said that Mary Lou Williams was the greatest female figure in instrumental jazz, but I think that's, you know, bracketing her, and I don't think that's right. I think Mary Lou Williams simply was one of the greatest pianists, composers, arrangers in the history of jazz, not gender specific. I was privileged to know Mary and to see her many times, see her perform, and spend some time with her. She was a wonderful human being. And there's one other thing, aside from her obvious contributions as a instrumentalist, as a pioneering big band arranger, and as a composer of works, including the masses that Peter mentioned. And that was as a teacher. Not particularly late in life, she taught at Duke University. She taught jazz history, and she taught young people how to play and how to sing, and she did that beautifully. But I mean the influence she had as a teacher in an informal way. Her apartment up in Harlem was a gathering spot for musicians. Thelonious Monk, Bud Powell, Jack Teagarden, everybody came up there. Benny Goodman. I think Mary was, you always hear a lot of things about Benny, and, they were good friends. I mean, she was one person who really liked Benny. There were a few others. She was she was like an informal university. And Mary had so many parts. When you listen to her early recordings, her first solo record, Nightlife and Dragon, which was recorded in 1930, is extraordinary. I mean, you can hear that she picked up on Earl Hines, who was the avant-garde pianist at the time, but she already had her own thing, and there's certain subtleties there, but don't come from Earl. Her arrangements, even the earliest ones, even before she was an actual member, regular member of the Andy Kirk Band, she wrote for it, and things like Messa Stomp are fascinating. They were really ahead of their time. And then the whole body of work that she created for the Andy Kirk Band, which was a very special kind of band, came out of Kansas City, but it was smaller than most big bands. It had a more intimate sound, and she really knew how to write for that band. And the band was like a family, and she was the lady who swings the band, which was one of the records they made. Later on, well, as Dr. Billy pointed out, was it this morning or was it yesterday? No, when you spoke when you emceed last night, I think. What an extraordinarily advanced sense of harmony she had. Yes. How much in what came to be known as bebop piano really comes from Mary. The Zodiac Suite is one example of that. Well, we'll get into other things. But relatively late in life, she got the idea of doing a joint concert at Carnegie Hall with Cecil Taylor. That was a courageous thing. It didn't quite come off, but that wasn't Mary's fault. She was ready, for anything. And at that concert, which was recorded, she did a solo version of I Can't Get Started, which is one of my favorite things of hers. I think there was a real emotional thing that was going on that night, and when she sat down to play that, it's just a tremendous performance. If you're not familiar with Mary's music, that would be a good starting point, because it's the song that everybody knows. Well, that's enough from me for the time being.
What was, as a writer and as a musician and as an educator, what was your take on Mary Lou Williams?
Well, my take on her was she showed me the way.
In what respect?
I was going through quite a few changes. I'm a symphony musician, strictly schooled, narrow in my focus, and I was going through a period of what I call deconservatizing. And 1975, I read a paper on black women and symphony orchestras. And there was a question afterwards that someone said, why don't you look into jazz? Well, I felt totally incompetent. Just at that time, in fact, it was 1978. Can you speak up a little more? 1978. She was doing a concert at St. Paul College in Lawrenceville, Virginia. And I decided to go, and that's where I first met Peter and Mary Lou. And I said, are you working very much? And she said, no, not as much as I would like to. So I said, well, I happen to have some money. And I did. I had a bundle of it. And I said, I would like you to share in what we have in Richmond, Virginia. I was artist in residence. And so we arranged 3 concerts. And I want to tell you about the first one. It's when I really knew this was an amazing human being. Do you remember this, Peter?
Mm-hmm.
It was a Baldwin piano. It was a concert for the city. And the piano was dropped. And I tried frantically to get Peter, Mary Lou, as they were driving up. You were driving, if I'm not mistaken. And I couldn't reach her. They got the best substitute they could, but I wanted to try to get what she wanted. And so when they got there, they were a little late. Peter was driving. And I said, Mary Lou, and I told her what had happened. I said, you want to come out and try the piano and test it? And she said, test the piano? I don't test piano. She said, that's the way we learn to play. If this key doesn't sound, then we just go for another one. But those dates were December 79, April 80. She did a master class at Virginia State University. Then May 80, she did a workshop for teachers in the Richmond Public Schools because of Joe Kennedy. And he said that his first date of any importance was with Mary Lou Williams. I managed to establish a very good relationship with her. And Peter was nice enough to let us spend some time together just chatting. I did an article for the Black Perspective in Music, the First Lady of Jazz, and I did an entry on her in the book Black Women in American Bands and Orchestras. And I, too, was there 3 weeks before she died. If you remember, you arranged it. And I showed her the photographs, which were absolutely gorgeous. Of course, she was not very well then, but I did notice that the right foot was steadily going. I'm going to stop there.
All right. You've written considerably, to some great length, as the book in your lap would indicate, about women in jazz. What was your take on Mary Lou?
Well, for me, Mary Lou was really the anchor. She was the timeline. As I researched this book over a number of years and discovered the history of women instrumentalists, I kept coming back to her in every decade. I found that I would come back to Mary Lou. She was always there. She was the constant against which we could... You can't hear me? Okay. She was the constant against which you could measure all the variables in the styles of music, in the opportunities that were available in terms of the social conditions. You could always look back sort of on a parallel track to see what Mary Lou was doing and to see what was happening for other women in jazz. But I do want to reiterate what Dan said, that regardless of gender, she was one of the giants. I was recently up at Bard College to introduce a film about Mary Lou, and I think that was the thing that we all came away with. Regardless of gender, she was one of the giants. But for the purposes of today's talk, I wanted to focus really a little bit more on her place in terms of the overall history of female instrumentalists. And I think that for me, it was fascinating to see her presence. She was pan-generational. She spanned all the decades. She was ahead of her time. If you look at what she was doing, for example, in the teens and the 20s, you can look at other women who were playing piano in other kinds of bands. Mary Kirk, who was Andy Kirk's wife. You can look at Lil Armstrong. You can see women in similar kinds of roles. The thing about Mary Lou, I think, was that she was doing it better than almost anybody else. Eddie Durham once said that she was she was the first woman that let people know that a woman could be great. And she couldn't be stopped. She was so great, she couldn't be stopped. I remember him saying this to me once when he was talking about those years. So, you know, as we go through these decades, I see her as so extraordinarily multidimensional. When you look at the kinds of things that women in jazz have to do, she had her own record label, she was an educator, she was a philanthropist, she was a player, she was a composer, she was extraordinary. She had sort of radiated this kind of absolute knowledge, absolute authority. And when you see it on film, certainly everyone on this panel knew her. I didn't know her particularly personally, except to have heard her play on several occasions in the very late 70s when she was back in New York. But she just radiated this presence, and she kind of came full circle, I guess, by talking about the spiritual importance of this music and going back to the blues. And always I was stricken by the message that she was always conveying to the audience about the blues and the roots of the music. And she gave what to me was one of the most profound definitions of this music, that we're always talking about what is jazz and what does it mean, and her definition, which I actually have here, about going back to the roots of the spirituals and the censored joys of the African American experience is what became jazz. So, you know, it's hard to, I could keep going, but why don't I turn it over to you and we'll come back to this, I'm sure.
Colleen, what was your
Well,
association with her and opinion of her?
Let me put it this way. Before I ever met her, when I was with the Sweethearts of Rhythm, I was not the bass player, I might add at this point. I was a guitarist in the rhythm section, and I was a special production vocalist. They would have the band, in fact, Maurice King was the musical director of the band at that time when I joined, which was in 1946. And they used to have, in fact, you probably wonder how I got in the band. It's very strange. It's interesting, the things that happen, and one thing leads to another. When I got with the Sweethearts, then the reason why I mentioned the Sweethearts was because we had a wonderful book. But one of the most exciting arrangements that we had in the book was an arrangement by Mary Lou Williams, her arrangement of St. Louis Blues. It was fantastic. Unfortunately, we were in a fire down in Salisbury, Maryland. I'll never forget this. We were playing for a graduation dance in this armory in Salem, in Salisbury. And along about intermission time, everybody got off the bandstand and they were walking around and milling around and drinking soda and whatever they were doing. And I noticed there was a big white lattice work behind the bandstand, and I noticed a puff of smoke over in the corner, stage
Left or right?
left.
Copy.
And so I said to the band boy, I said, you know, I think I see something over there in the corner. So he checked, he went up on the bandstand, he checked, and when he moved the lattice work, the whole bandstand, the whole stage went up in smoke.
Oh, man.
And we were throwing music off the bandstand, and unfortunately, the whole bottom line of that story is that we lost that arrangement. So no one ever got a chance to really become familiar with that fantastic arrangement. Okay, that was my first tangible awareness of Mary Lou Williams. I'd never met her. I knew what she looked like, but I'd never met her in person. Okay, now about 20 years later, I was singing, I used to do a lot of concert choral work, and I was in a professional contracted chorus to sing a concert that Mary Lou was doing at Carnegie Hall, a sacred concert. And so during one of the rehearsals for this concert, I decided to introduce myself to her because we had a mutual friend. So during a break in the rehearsals, I went up and sat right on the piano bench beside her, and I introduced myself to her and mentioned the mutual friend's name. And she said, oh, yes, yes. So we did the concert. It was recorded live. I have the album at home. It's one of my treasures. And there are pictures of all of us on the back, and I'm in the front row with right behind Mary Lou. I'm proud of that. And Honey Gordon was one of the soloists. Leon Thomas was one of the soloists. And three of the things that she did that night were Thank You, Jesus, which Leon did, Our Father, which was sung by Honey Gordon, and also Praise the Lord, which Leon did, and with the chorus behind. She really knew how to handle voices and to get that excitement. And I was really impressed, and I was in awe of Mary Lou. And in fact, the first piece was sort of like a spiritual. The second piece, Our Father, was in memory. In fact, she wrote that in memory of Father Anthony Woods, who was her spiritual advisor until his death. And then the third piece, Praise the Lord, was a gospel style, with modern harmony. That's what made it so. She was so ahead of her time. It was just, you just couldn't put your finger on it. As soon as you put your finger on her, she was off and running to another harmonic level. You know, it was fantastic. Then after that time, Mary Lou asked me, did I know any things that she could use to help her finish her recording of her Mass. She called it Music for Peace, but it was more later popularly known as Mary Lou's Mass. So I said, sure, I know some friends of mine, and a lot of us used to do a lot of studio work, background vocals for different people, like, well, we could have been recording for the McGuire sisters, which a lot of you may not even know. So this dates me, but nevertheless, I don't care.
That's right.
Billy and I are in the same.
I'm older than you.
Yes, well, you're a little bit older than me, but we're in the same decade. But anyway, so what I'm saying to say is that all of this happened, and I had, let me see, my three friends were Christine Spencer, Randy Payton,
Eileen Gilbert.
and Eileen Gilbert. Thank you, Peter. And so we helped her flesh out and finish her Mass. And she found out I played bass, and so I was put to work doing that too, and then I would play something, and then it would be overdubbed if I had to sing a solo. But two of the vocal solo things that she asked me to do were the setting of the Lord's Prayer. She asked me what key I sang it in, or what key would be comfortable for me, because she liked my voice and she wanted me to do it. So I remember E-flat minor is the key that I sing the Lord's Prayer in. And also this song, Lazarus, which is about the Lazarus and the poor man, you know, and the rich man and Lazarus. And so that is also another one of my cherished recordings. Now, after that, she invited me to join her in playing a prologue of her music when Alvin Ailey wanted to choreograph her Music for Peace, Mary Lou's Mass. So wow, I mean, have bass will travel. I was ready to go anywhere with Mary Lou. She said, go to the moon. I was ready. So we did, on evenings when her Mass was going to be performed, we would do a prologue of her music for that evening, just a trio, she and I and a drummer. I don't remember who the drummer was at this particular point in time. But anyway, so we would do a prologue of some of her things, and then the Mass would be put on, and then I'd have to go to work singing in the chorus and playing the bass and then singing vocal solos. I was in seventh heaven. Then after that, she asked me to join her in going to Kansas City to help open the first Women's Jazz Festival, which was in 1977, I think, I do believe it was. And so I went with her to Kansas City, and my bass and I were traveling. And we played some of her things, some of her tunes, and then we played some of her favorites. And I remember Leonard Feather was the MC back in those days for all those women's jazz festivals. And let me see, one more little note here. Oh, yes. She asked me, she was always asking me, and I'm always saying yes. I'm even today, she's been dead all these years, and I'm still in awe of having been considered a friend of hers. At the Whitney Museum in New York City, she wanted to do a consolidated version of some of the things in her Mass. She asked me to get the singers. So I called our contractor, who used to do all the contracting work for Ailey, and she asked for 11 people. So I picked out the people, and we rehearsed, And then she asked me to conduct this group. So, and she was doing another piece that was not originally included in her first recording of her Mass, Lamb of God. You remember that,
Yeah.
Peter? And it turned out so well, and I was trying to think of the New York critic, jazz critic.
Gary Giddens?
No, not Gary
John
Giddens.
Wilson.
John
Wilson.
John Wilson.
For the Times.
He wrote such, from the New York Times. He wrote such a wonderful write-up. You know, when you're in the middle of all this, you don't think about all the things that may be consequential from what you do. But I still have that write-up that John wrote about that particular evening's performance. But it was just so much, it filled me up so much to think that I was part of all this, and she was always asking me. And I may get a little emotional about this because she was like my big sister. And I guess I'll always miss her, but she's always on my mind. And this coming Sunday, when I get back to New York, I will be singing the Our Father prayer and Lazarus in a concert of the New York branch of the National Association of Negro Musicians. I belong to the Thomas Music Study Club, and I will be singing those two songs in the concert because Mary's birthday would be May the 8th, and our concert is on May the 5th. So I thought I wanted to do that to honor her memory and always keep her music out there as best I can. And I have some plans for some things in the future, which maybe I'll talk about when they are consummated. I guess I'll stop there for the time being.
Thank you, Carly. Mary Lou Williams was unique, and as you can tell from what we all say, it had nothing to do with gender. She was one of the greatest musicians jazz has produced. She was a person whose music spoke for itself. She was ahead of her time. She told me at one time, she played for many of the older players, and really, as a child, as a very young musician, she got to play for Jelly Roll Morton. And so she incorporated, having heard him play and played some of his music, she incorporated many of the things that he did in her earlier styles. And so she was familiar with, stylistically, the things that Morton was famous for, and the fact that he had an influence on Earl Hines and that he had an influence on later pianists. She incorporated that knowledge into her take on Earl Hines. Earl Hines was an influence, as Dan said, on her. She actually was very friendly with Art Tatum. She was very highly respected. Duke Ellington wanted her to write for her on a very lengthy basis. She wrote a few things, but that wasn't what she had in mind at that particular time. When I was a kid in Washington here, I went to the Howard Theater to see the Andy Kirk Band. And most of you who are younger remember pictures of her as she was up in years, and she was much older and heavier and so forth. I got to tell you, when she was a young woman, she was sharp. She was a gorgeous lady. And when several of us who were teenagers went to hear her play with the Andy Kirk Clouds of Joy, and we went back to see the show again because this lady not only sounded good, she looked good. And so when she was playing, but she played so with such fire and with such passion that you always were carried up in that. So even though you might initially have been attracted because she was a beautiful lady, you really got caught up in what she was doing and how she was doing it. She fired I mean fired up in not the other way. She was the driving force of the rhythm section. And that was, I don't remember the bass player, but Ben Thigpen was, Ed Thigpen, a great drummer who's played with Oscar Peterson. His father was Ben Thigpen, was the drummer in that band. One of the swingers drummers you ever heard. And the way they would lock up together, I mean, it really propelled the band in a way that was very important in the days of the swing bands. This band could hold its own rhythmically and dance-wise, because that was what they were judged on when it came to swinging, with anybody. And it was primarily because of Mary Lou and Ben, and as I said, I'm ashamed to say I don't remember the bass player.
Booker Collins.
Who?
Booker Collins.
Booker Collins, thank you. They had their take on the Kansas City feeling. And so what they did rhythmically really was an updating of that. Mary Lou, later, when I moved to New York, I was playing in a Broadway show. I was playing in the band. And she was one of the stars of the show. The star, the person who was carrying the show, was Ethel Waters. Mary Lou played a trio set in the middle of the show. Now, you got to understand, on Broadway, you are given a spot of X amount of time, 8 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever. You don't hold that spot, you lose it, right? Okay. She was in the middle of people who were really showbiz oriented, who had all of the things that make you, the motions and the eyes and the hands and all that go with it. She held her spot simply by sitting there playing with the trio. Now, this is one, for a visually oriented audience, this is a tremendously powerful statement to make, because she did this musically. She didn't rely on contortions or anything. She sat there very straight and played the piano. But she played with such passion that this audience just, after every show, we did, this particular show only ran a few weeks on Broadway, but it was called Blue Holiday. And she really held the spot in a way that only a master artist can do, of any style. Mary Lou had this quality as a teacher, which was one of the most engaging qualities of her personality. She had a way of telling you were doing something wrong and making you feel, well, gee, yeah, that's nice, but I knew I could correct that, you know? And, but it was in the way that she presented it to you that she just didn't say, you don't do that very well, or something that would make you feel bad. She would say, that's not the way to do that. There are other ways, and really, as a teacher, put you in the place where you're going to try to figure it out, because you know that's what she wants you to do. That's the mark, for me, that's the mark of a great teacher. I mean, to inspire you to do this, as opposed to taking you by the hand and say, come over here. I mentioned the fact that this is what she did with Thelonious Monk and with Bud Powell. And I recommend that you listen to some of their earlier records, earlier in the 40s, and then listen to their later records in the 50s. And it is not just the difference in technology. You hear a different sound from those two piano players. She took them to her house and really worked on them, because she had a wonderful touch. And she worked on their touch. And it still sounds like Bud Powell. It still sounds like Monk. But they're deeper in the keys. They're doing something that they were not doing physically and mentally before they studied with Mary Lou Williams. And I think this, if she did nothing else, she did that for us in jazz, which is, I think, just a remarkable accomplishment.
Billy,
Yeah.
there are two things when you finish it I want to pick up on what she said.
Well, that really was the main thing that I wanted to speak to her, speak about her as not only a friend, but as someone who most of my formative years and all of the rest of my life I felt highly indebted to. One of the, Peter mentioned the fact that one of the pieces she played was It's a Grand Night for Swinging. That was my theme song. It became her theme song. One of the most flattering things that any friend can do for you is to play your music. And she used one of the songs, with all of the wonderful things she wrote, she used something that I wrote as her theme song. And I really, it just knocked me out. I mean, I was very appreciative of this, because I respected her so much. And she had written so many, Walking and Swinging was a classic in the 30s. I mean, everybody wanted to play Walking and Swinging. Betty Goodman, everybody else. She had written other classics, and for her to pick someone else's music to play over and over again, I thought was a very wonderful thing to do. You had some things to say.
I had two issues. One was Peter O'Brien, because I got at the end to spend so much time with her in a hotel room, driving her around. A lot of people were confused about this relationship between Mary Lou Williams and Peter O'Brien. I am here to tell you that was one of the most beautiful relationships. She relied on him for all business decisions. And that links up with something that you said, Carlene, about the Women's Festival. Understand she tore it up because when she was telling me about it, what happened, you had to shut her up. Don't say that.
Did I do that?
Yes, you did. So you
sorry.
might want to say a little bit about that festival, because on the subject of gender, because she said everything she knew and everything she learned from men. And she didn't say what the women wanted to hear. So you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Oh.
I think it's important for this conference.
Well, being
Sorry.
not a woman, I pick up on Eddie Durham first. I think she related to musical people. Now, I know she hung out a lot with Melba, but that's because Melba could write.
Yeah.
Not because Melba was a woman. I don't think she had, Honey Gordon could sing like Sarah Vaughan. Really. I mean, that recording Carlene talks about, that's a fabulous thing. Honey just soaring up like a bird, you know. So she was very, very ill in that bed upstairs, you know.
Yeah.
And I was kind of fielding the phone calls by then. And I said, you want to talk to Eddie Durham? She grabbed the phone. You see what I mean? So, and he come to the cookery all the time. If I think of a parallel person, it's kind of like Mingus. I'm sorry I wasn't a better manager in really to facilitate more stuff. If I could have done that, I feel good about what happened. What happened, happened. But kind of like Mingus, it's kind of like that. And weird. And Mingus called her for Honey. Where can I get that singer you had? I think you too, Carlene, I'm not sure. I think
Yeah,
you
I
wanted
worked
you
for
too.
Mingus.
See?
Yeah.
And so it's that kind of world, a highly musical world. Now these women. It became a big thing, a big political thing in the 70s, much different from now, I think. You know, she didn't make it that way. And I think she resented maybe her position, which she gained sheer force of personality and musical ability, I think. Ability, one time I said something or other about George Wein, I forget, you know, and he said, oh no, George knows my ability. That sentence struck me today, I was thinking about it. So she was quite clear about who she was and her ability. And as a matter of fact, when she said people this and that, she meant musicians. The word people meant musicians. That was her world. The cornballs, the rest of the cornballs, keep them away from me. Things like that. You know, I had to do a lot of football work, you know, in a club and backstage. So it's a deeply, deeply musical thing. So I don't know, what did she say? I really can't say. I can't say what she said. No.
Well, I remember we were sitting
Out
in
in
a
Kansas City.
restaurant,
Oh, pardon me.
and there was a radio interview or television or something,
Oh.
and she was going off about women and how they were making an issue of it, and you kind of pulled her back.
I was
and
more codependent.
Yeah. But in
And I
terms
was
of
worried
women,
about who would give her a job and who wouldn't, stuff like that, and she could care less.
in terms of women, she frequently talked about how women related to each other in the 30s, late 20s. And she said there was not the competition. You know, we were all good, we all helped each other. When you finish your date, you'd go down and hear the other person. You don't have that now, and that disturbed her a great deal. In terms of Carlene, she often told me about the time that Charlie Mingus called her and said, Lou, they messing up my music, and I need some singers. And she said, I got one for you. and that was Carlene. She said he called her 4 o'clock. She called him 4. He called her 4 o'clock the next morning to say, where'd you get her from? But there's so many stories like that.
Well, Mary Lou Williams was, because she lived in another time, it wasn't just women who were more supportive. The whole field was more supportive. The jam session that jam sessions that were held in those days were really determined by talent. I mean, anyone could get up and play at one time, but to be asked for the second time, you had to have been able to do very well the first time. And if you didn't, you were not allowed to come back and waste people's time. They handled it in a lot of ways. It had less to do with gender, as you suggest, than it had to do with musicianship. So that whole period from the 20s through the mid-40s, it began to change around 1946, 47 in terms of the manner in which musicians related to one another, and it was economic. It had a great deal to do with people returning from the war, musicians who had been in the service, a scarcity of jobs, a change of attitude, no longer places in big bands. A lot of things were happening that made people more self-centered and less willing to help others as they had in the past. It's unfortunate, and it has never been really documented to the extent that it should, because so much happened to music in general, to our perception of what was popular music, that Mary Lou was in front of and managed to stay on top of in playing in clubs like the Hickory House, and playing in Le Downbeat, and playing in many of the other clubs that she played in Harlem, Wells in Harlem. She was a person who when things changed, if she chose to, and this was after she had gone to Europe and had some unfortunate experiences and gotten out of the music and so forth. When she finally came back in the 50s, she really wanted to see, you know, can I fit into this? And with a lot of help, she was able to do that. But that had its ups and downs also. Yeah. Do you know more about that?
She was very worried. One time, I think she was very frightened that she might not be able to get work at a certain point. Now, this has got to be after 1964, because she said it to me. Yeah. And she said, I can always make beaded bags. And I just terrible, just awful, the thought of that this great thing would have to make these beaded bags and sell them. So it was, you know, I would say in the 60s, not only everything that happened earlier, but the whole economic thing went in another direction with rock and different kinds of music, too. Mm-hmm. So when we went into the Cookery in 1971, I went around saying we have 2.5 clubs in New York, meaning the Village Gate, the Vanguard, and what was down on Hudson Street?
Half Note.
I was going to call it the Half Moon. The Half Note, and that was half a week.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? You had a big act and a small act in the Gate, and you always had the Vanguard. Max stuck to it, you know. But that was pretty avant-garde, too. That's the only thing that got him there. I went there to try to get her in, and she's a good piano player. He went back in the kitchen. You know. But she was very, very frightened at one point about maybe not being able to make it. Work not available for anybody.
Something else might have gotten into that as far as Max was concerned. Mary Lou used to headline at one of his chief competitors, Bonnie Josephson, who owned the Cookery, owned the Cafe Society. And Cafe Society at one time was a big competition in the late 40s, big competition to
Max himself then.
Yeah.
She worked for Max, too, in 1949 for about 12 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you realize it, but...
she did the Zodiac Suite when she wrote that. She was working at Cafe Society. She worked that quite a bit.
Quite a bit. Yeah.
But, you know, I think one of the things that I'd like for you to comment on for a minute is the whole thing that happened to Mary when she left music, and not because she was, at that time, nervous about not being able to get work, but after she converted and felt that music was something sinful, right? And then it was her spiritual advisor Father Wood, who got her back into playing.
Right, that's before me. Mary stopped musically, I think, maybe January of '55. She becomes a Catholic sometime in '56. She doesn't work again until Dizzy takes her out to Newport in the summer of '57. There's and I think Melba did those arrangements.
Yes.
Of the three parts of the Zoda and karaoke. There was also a recording date then, in October of '57, and Melba did those arrangements. I think Mary was not, I don't know what happened. I really don't know what happened, and all the years with her and listening and talking, it must have been so interior and so profound, I don't know what happened that made her stop like that. One time when she was sick later, she said, maybe God is angry because I stopped playing. Wow. She said that once, too. That was when she was very ill toward the end. I don't know. I don't know what, maybe the whole thing caved in for her in many different ways. I'd say something like this, but menopause, she was 45 in 1955, maybe, just physically maybe. She also just dove at a one-year-old nephew at that point. That nephew became the son she never had, born in 1956. The whole motherly thing went right over there. Maybe it was just too rough, too many years, too much push. And sometimes I felt awful at how much she did and how much was being created and how little the payback was. And she would do things for next to nothing, too, once she got, you know, so I think the religious thing reconstitutes her. And I think maybe she went through something very awful at the age of 45, a deep interior thing. You know, John of the Cross calls it Black Night, the Dark Night of the Soul. And people have all kinds of middle-age collapses. So, but she reinvents herself. That's not the right word. She regenerates herself. Mm-hmm. And her religious faith, I think, is part of how she did that. So Woods was a good guy. I knew him. When I was a kid in high school, Woods was, he was a parish priest. He didn't teach me. But he had all these artistic, Village Light Opera Company. Xavier had a numbered stage. It was a beautiful little theater they had on 16th, right next to that church he was photographed in. He had the Xavier players, out-of-work actors. He was all involved with the arts. And Barry Ulanoff brought Mary to him. See, Ulanoff was an intense Catholic at that point. Mm. That's her godfather. He wrote the first book on Duke Ellington.
Yes.
So these worlds keep, my worlds and hers, and her worlds crisscross. And there's some regeneration that takes place. And now, she used to ask me lots of questions 6 years later, and I was only 23. I didn't know how to answer them. Now I would know how to handle them. But she was really on the prowl for something. You know, she was really looking for some way. And
in terms of this relationship of Mary Lou Williams and Peter, they team taught at Duke. He was the historian, and it was for real. And she wanted everyone to know and understand that. You can see how much history he knows, not only about Mary Lou, but also about the history of jazz. The other thing, when I found Cleopatra Brown, came back and I told Mary Lou, I said, you know who I found out in Denver? Cleopatra Brown. Now, you don't know who she is, and I won't go into it, but she was somebody. And Mary Lou said, where is she? I get her into the cookery. I said, no,
see that's right.
She does not want to talk with you because you're playing the devil's music. Although she was playing for, Petra Brown was playing for a Seventh-day Adventist church, you could still hear the boogie-woogie in her left hand. But I remember that discussion very well.
Cleo Brown had profound influence on Dave Brubeck and quite a few other pianists. She was one of the best known pianists in the 30s. And I see Dr. Dorothy Donegan sitting over there. Do you know her, Dorothy?
I say, and Mary Lou Williams, I knew too. Joe Glazer, who handled Mary Lou Williams, Andy Kerr, wanted me to replace her. And so I said, how many men in this band? So I said, no, I'd rather stay with my mother and I didn't want the job. He offered me $150 a week and all expenses, but I preferred to stay at home. And then Mary Lou Williams taught Marion McPartland how to play. And Marion McPartland wasn't working, and Mary Lou Williams wasn't. So address that for me.
I have 3 tapes where we talked about various things, and I listened to it last night, one of them, where she addressed that issue. And then she had me to erase it because she was not a vicious person. So she didn't want it documented. So I erased it. But there was a little conflict there.
Yeah, I never heard that she taught Marion to play.
No, I never heard
She
that.
may have sat down and played with her, or done something or other with her left hand, but, you know, a very informal, indirect thing, but, you know.
Well, Marion was an accomplished pianist by the
long
time
before.
she came here from England, but I think what Mary might have done is she might have taught her to swing. I mean, that's probably what it was.
Or sat with her, yeah.
Anyway, they
have-
did a wonderful show together. Mary was a guest on Marion's show, and that's on a CD.
We have already opened the floor for discussion with Dr. Donegan. Now, I have another question from Rusty.
My name is Rusty Hassan. I'm a programmer, a radio programmer here in Washington, D.C. And I just wanted to share with the participants in an audience the note that Marion sent me when her recording Zoning came out. And I think maybe the panelists want to comment on the fact that she was also an entrepreneur that had her own label, Mary Records. And in 1974, she released a very cutting-edge album called Zoning. And when she sent me the recording, she sent me this note that I will always treasure. She said, and this is dated July 15th, 1974. Hi, Tony Waters called me today and said you'd like my new LP. Gee, thanks. I'm trying like mad to get through. It's needed on Earth. Zoning the Fungus on side 2 describes in music how black musicians combine Afro exercise, free, foreign, etc. into our great art, jazz. She just went on to deal with how the music was really being reinterpreted through this, and how she needed help with the airplay, that it was getting recorded and on the air on AM radio in Pittsburgh, her hometown. And again, gee, thanks for the help, you know. And then I did get to meet her. And it was just so touching to me that here I was, a young radio programmer in my early 20s, and she took time to write a personal letter to go along with the record and educate a young radio programmer along with her music. And again, I think it's really important to talk about how she would just touch anybody she came in contact with and talk about the music. And I want to thank the opportunity to share this brief note that she sent me with the participants on this very important program today.
Thank you.
Dr. Taylor,
Yes.
could you address the issue of keeping the name alive and the music alive? What could be done to...
Well, this is a start. The Mary Lou Williams Women in Jazz Festival. The Kennedy Center has named this particular festival after her for that very reason, so that, for instance, in one of the local papers, there was a very nice article on who she was and why we called it the Mary Lou Williams Festival. And so that is beginning to have people realize that though this one woman broke through and did many things over her lifetime, she was paving the way for a great number of people who have the potential for doing that kind of thing in their own way, hopefully in the future. I think that what we have to do as musicians, the best way to keep any musician like Mary Lou alive is to play our music.
Yeah.
And the more we can play the things that she left us, which spoke from her heart, the better tribute we can pay to her. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, I'm learning about Mary now, and I wanted to ask what suggested recordings would be appropriate for someone just learning about her.
Are you a pianist? Are you also, Ken?
American
I
Music
can do
Center.
my changes while I'm learning my
There are
charts.
two things you can get in Washington. 2 CDs put out by Smithsonian Folkways. Zoning that Rusty just talked about has been reissued, and it's much better than the first time around. The clarity is better, and also the stuff we didn't issue is on that. And also the Zodiac Suite, you can get those too. Also, Andy Kirk, you can get a thing called Mary's Idea on BMG, the old Decca recordings. That's just out. Let's see, what else? There's lots of things. I don't know. More's coming gradually. You just have to watch. The big problem is that the stuff is issued the Smithsonian things will stay put, period. Now, the other things, an artist like Mary is promoted a certain amount, they issue a certain number of copies, and then they're gone. And you have to wait till the next time somebody decides to reissue. There's 2 on Vogue, too.
French label?
Yeah, they're here. Mary Lou Williams in London. That's got another tune of Billy's on it, Titoro. And also the Mary Lou Williams Quartet with Don Byas. That's beautiful.
Mary's Waltz.
That has Mary's Waltz on it, which is a gorgeous thing written by Herbie Nichols and Mary Lou Williams. See, it's not a gender thing. Every time I think of another major, Herbie Nichols, grab. Andrew Hill, grab. She went after Cecil because he played. You see what I mean? It's music, music. That's available. That's hard. That's not a beginner's thing. The Mary Lou Williams and Cecil Taylor, it's on Fantasy, but it has that luminous piano solo at the end after the concert's over. She just dug in. That's my favorite, too.
You know, work
In
I
answer
like
to
is
your
the
question,
fungus
though,
among
what can be done, I think a lot should be done by, if your consciousness is raised by these sessions, then you as an individual can do something. You can request her music, you can learn her music, you can both do it yourself and have other people perform her music. One of the things we did not do was to ask, we intended to ask the musicians to play some Mary Lou Williams, and in fact, we said, if this is something that is that you feel comfortable doing, please do it. 1 or 2 groups have decided to do this, but in her spirit, the thing that she would want is the musicians to do what they do best, whatever that is. If it happens to be something of hers, fine. If not, then shoot your best shot. And she said that to all of her students, you know. So in that spirit, we didn't say, hey, at least 1 Mary Lou tune every set, you know. That would have been terrific, and maybe next time we will do that. But the first time around, I thought it best to do things in her spirit.
Jerry Allen looked like Mary last night.
Yes.
She did.
Yes.
And the face, and how she moved and all that, and the thinking.
Yeah.
Jerry portrays Mary Lou in an upcoming film called Kansas City, Robert Altman film. I've seen a preview of it, and the music is in the film throughout, but nobody ever talks about it. And so Jerry's not identified as Mary Lou, but she plays an arrangement of Mary's of Lullaby of the Leaves, and she does a beautiful job, and she even looks a little bit like her. She has also performed Mary Lou's music in public, and I ought to mention here that the Lincoln Center Jazz Orchestra has done some of Mary's arrangements. Last night we heard Diva play Roland. That was a new arrangement of Roland, but that was a very famous chart that Mary did for Benny Goodman's band. And the Institute of Jazz Studies is very honored to be the repository, thanks to Father O'Brien, of Mary's music and a lot of her personal scrapbooks, photographs, her record collection. There are people who have made use of this, and there's presently a young lady who is doing her dissertation on Mary Lou. So the arrangements, that music is available for somebody who wants to perform it, orchestras, whatever. It's very important to do these things to keep the music alive. Last summer in Memphis, right after a panel with Dr. Billy and other people on Ellington, there was a convention of the International Association of Jazz Record Collectors, and one of the guests there on a panel was none other than John Williams, who was Mary's first husband, who was 91 last year. He's now 92. Who is the most amazing man. He is as sharp as in more than any of us, has terrific recall, and among other things also told some great stories about Mary. But it's impressive. He was somebody who taught her a lot. I think they got married when she was, what, 17?
1926.
Yeah,
I think.
16.
16, yeah. They were together at...
They were together playing for an act, and then the act broke up, and John took over the band. But when things were bad, she wasn't playing with the band, but they would bring her out, and she would play some piano, and everybody in the place would look around, and they would see this young girl, you know, playing the piano. And I mentioned this because of what has been said before here. What they would say, and Mary was very proud of that. She mentioned it in interviews years later. They say, "Listen to that little girl. She's playing like a man." I shouldn't say that here, perhaps, but that was, Mary made a point of repeating that very often.
Yes, ma'am.
Virginia State graduate.
The name is Geneva Perry. I'm trying to establish, correct some myths, and at the same time, I'm trying to maybe correct some myths that I've been hearing here. One is, I'm asking as a question, where was she born? Was she from Lancaster, Pennsylvania originally, or did she live there?
Atlanta.
Born in Atlanta and moved to Pittsburgh at a very young age.
And moved to where?
Georgia.
Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh.
Moved to Pittsburgh, that's where she grew up.
Okay, because I did meet her with a friend who was from Lancaster, and I thought she might have lived there for a while then in Lancaster.
No.
Well, Vi Burnside, I used to play with Sweethearts Rhythm, and we went to visit her at Hickory. Vi was from Lancaster, and it seemed as if they knew each other as a result of some experience in Lancaster, and I just wasn't sure whether it was just that you passed through or lived there for a while or worked there for a while. That's why I was trying to get that correction in my mind, but she was from Atlanta. Okay, great. Now, the other thing is I kind of question whether, I really knew a great deal, I heard a great deal, I should say, about her experience of giving up music for that length of time. I understood that it happened while she was in France. Is that correct?
I don't think so.
It started in France, I mean, and then when she came back here, and she was doing very little about music except sort of encouraging the downtrodden musicians and so forth. Am I correct in that analysis? Okay, because...
I don't know what the chronology is. That's something somebody has to research by talking to people who were there.
Okay, because...
Something went wrong in France. I don't know what.
Yeah, okay,
She
great.
did go out and she walked off 2 jobs.
Yes.
Simultaneous jobs. She had a job in a club and in a theater.
Okay.
And she went out in the country to Gerard Pochonnet, a French drummer, was a boyfriend, to his grandmother's house, and she slept. And she read the Psalms. She came back to New York. A lot of this stuff is mythical because you find letters and attempts to work, and she made a recording for George Simon in New York in 1955 when she came back. This is all 54 in Paris, all right? Then she does go into a deep, and she had nothing. She lived on 144th Street, and Xavier was on 16th Street, and she used to walk there to see Father Woods. And, you know, so there was a big interior withdrawal for a long time, and it also involved the church.
Right.
And there's an evolution there, I think.
Now, the other...
And that business about toward the poor came out then, too.
Yeah, about helping the downtrodden musicians.
Usually musicians, but other people too.
Yeah, right. And that she had sort of a second-hand
Help
store.
me.
Yeah.
That's later.
Okay.
That's much later. That's in the 60s, after she comes up out of all this, and
Yeah.
she's working again.
Well, yeah, because I met her in the 60s, like 63, I think it was, when I was working up in New York. Now, the other question that well, it's not really a question. Well, in a way it is. No transcribing has been done of her work that she did with Andy Kirk, or do you know?
Everything.
Oh, it has been.
I've done all that.
Oh, great. Thank you very much.
I haven't done the transcript. I have caused it to happen.
Yeah, cause it-
Almost
whatever.
all of it, not everything.
Okay.
But all, you know, maybe 30 things or 25 things.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. You mentioned the importance of swinging because it was necessary in order to get people on the dance floor. I think now people feel there's a kind of snobbery with jazz. They go to a jazz club and they never feel like they can dance. Do you think that that might be a thing that could bring back a lot of fans to jazz?
It might very well. One of the things that has happened is that people are more rhythmically oriented now than they have been in the last 20 or 30 years. And so because of rock and because of other kinds of rhythm, it may be possible to have jazz groups play for dancing. One of the myths about jazz was that people stopped dancing to bebop, and that wasn't true. Because in places in Harlem and in many other black communities, people always danced to bebop. As a matter of fact, I remember people doing the Madison, this is post-bop, and people were doing the Madison to Miles Davis kind of blue album, the Freddie Freeloader cut. And so, so people never really stopped dancing to music that moved them to dance. So it's Horace Silver, Art Blakey always had that in mind, and they wanted people to pat their foot, or if they felt like it, dance. People did dance to Horace Silver down at the Village Gate. And so one thing about myths, they're self-perpetuation, self-perpetuating, but they're not always true.
Mary mentioned that to me too, Billy, about people dancing to bop.
Sure.
And her brother, Jerry, was telling me about that. And she tried every now and again. She did put out some 45s, and they weren't too good. She made a direct effort to engage the kids by dancing. And she wasn't really a good producer that way, you know, but that's what she was trying to do.
She wanted, as many artists want, to reach out to people and have them realize that her music was coming from her directly to them. It's not easy when you have people with other expectations, when they are expecting you to do specific things that they may have heard someone else do, or that they've heard on records, or that they have conceived, that they put you in a particular category and say, this is what she does. And for most of her career, people wanted to hear her play boogie-woogie. And she loved to play boogie-woogie, but not all the time. She wanted to play some other things. One of the things that has come up several times is the Zodiac Suite. I refer those of you who are interested in really one of the high points of her career to that recording by the Smithsonian of the Zodiac Suite, because and look at the time element. Look at when she created this music. I mean, this is before Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker and Thelonious Monk and the musicians who really fashioned bebop into the style that we all know and associate with. This had all of the elements except some of the melodic things that came out of performance. And so, but the theory and the point of view is all there. All of the elements. I mean, in terms of what the rhythm section is doing, the change in the role of the drummer and the bass player and the piano player. So you hear a lot of those things going on in Mary Lou Williams' work.
There's a question over here.
Yes.
Yes, tomorrow I'm actually going to be playing with Joanne Brackeen's group, and one of the tunes that we're going to do is called Gloria.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask about this piece because I've only heard enough of it to just get the melody, and then the tape cuts off. But it's so advanced. I mean, she's playing stuff that Herbie, was doing later, after Miles, and, as well as it's funky, it has that gospel church feeling. And then it has the harmonics of it are the harmony is so advanced, you know, so that's really, I really need to get this recording, you know, so, I mean, if you know anything about it, please, you know, tell me where I can find it.
Does it have words on it?
It's just instrumental.
Okay, there are two versions of that. It's probably from the zoning put out by
Zoning.
Smithsonian Folkways.
Okay.
We issued one, and there was one that didn't get issued with a different rhythm section. Two different feelings. That's from her mass.
She wants to know how can she get it
How can you get it now?
Yes.
as soon as
I
possible.
could fly to New York and back.
Oh,
I don't know. I suppose so, yeah.
Is it available on record that could be
Yes,
bought?
it's issued by Smithsonian Folkways.
I mean, the one
Folkwell? Folkway.
Tower.
Records.
Oh, okay.
or Borders, or
Okay.
Borders, Tower or Borders, perhaps here in town.
I'd like to
Okay.
meet you after.
Yeah,
That's a
because,
question.
I mean,
Don't go.
Based on something.
you just spoke about how advanced she was writing, you know, for that time, but she actually, I don't know when she wrote this piece, but
1973.
we're playing, I mean, people are writing like this now, you
Yeah.
know? I mean, it's just, it's really incredible that she, you know, she was from, so, you know, she was born, I mean, she started playing so long ago, and she just moved with the time. You know,
The
that's
thing to
amazing.
remember about Mary Lou Williams was that for all of her life, she continued to grow. So this is not true of many musicians, but for her, you can literally hear her as she progressed through the various, she lived through most of the styles of jazz, and she played them all. So she played a ragtime, boogie woogie, she played stride, she played swing, she played bebop, she played post bop, she played the kind of extemporaneous improvisations and the kinds of things that became associated with Cecil Taylor and others. But she was doing that from another perspective early, very early, back in the 40s. She would go to a man's house named Timmy Rosencrantz and just play. It was a concert pianist who used to come there a lot, who played 12-tone music. And she would play an improvisation of the things she was hearing, as did Stuff Smith and many other musicians who heard this pianist.
How did people react to her as far as, I mean, because like when Coltrane plays some advanced stuff for the time, or even Bird, you know, they didn't get like the respect until later. I mean, did
It
she?
varied. It depended on what she played, but differently, she had a different approach from either Coltrane or some of the other people who played in that style. Mary really was trying to say, this is something which is not straight ahead, but it's something that I feel. So there was always a certain passion in what she did, in that style, that you could go with if you didn't understand what she was doing.
Right. Okay, thank you.
I see a hand in the back. Oh, Denise?
I don't have a question. I'd just like to make a statement. I'd like to say thank you very much. Because as a musician, you pick up a piece of sheet music, or maybe even listen to something on a recording, and you then attempt to play it. When you get a little bit of when you get a lot of insight, especially from a personal standpoint, from those who have spent time with the particular composer, it just does something. Just sitting here has done something for me. And when I go back to play her music, you brought something else to it. And I think this is not done very much, where people just talk about their experience with the particular composer who has passed on. But I consider it very valuable to have been able to be here at this moment, and I'm glad I was able to take advantage of it. So
Well,
thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. One of the things that is not done often enough, I think, is this kind of reminiscence. Jazz Times, the magazine, does it on occasion when they will have a Clark Terry or someone and invite a lot of his friends to come and talk about it, the various experiences they've had together and things that are not common knowledge but are important to the people close to the person who's being honored. That's what we tried to do on this particular occasion, simply because hopefully it throws light for all of us to follow in the footsteps of someone who really, despite her own misgivings about her own progress, achieved a tremendous amount of success in many areas of music, and has left in the repertoire many things which can serve the same purpose as the music of John Coltrane or Duke Ellington or any other great artist who has, through his or her creative efforts, left a body of material that we can all study and become better musicians. I think that alone is something that, thanks to Dan and Peter, we now have access to, and we can be helpful in requesting and perhaps adding some funds, because with the cutbacks that we all are aware of, it's not possible to do some of the things that we might want to do. So in the spirit of Mary Lou, if we want to get her music, we can help them get this music copied. That's very expensive. Get it, make it available so that we can all play it. I mean, it's there, but it needs to be put into a usable form, and that takes money and effort on somebody's part. So if it's something that anybody here wants to participate in, I would suggest you get in touch with these two gentlemen who handle that aspect of what she does, and move us a little further down the road, so that the next time we have at the Kennedy Center a festival of Mary Lou Williams, we can call up and say, I want the arrangement of, and get Gloria or one of the things that we might want to present in the context of our salute to a wonderful artist. And it doesn't have to be a Mary Lou Williams festival for us to do that.
You know, even though there are no more disciplines at the National Endowment for the Arts, I'll stick my neck out and say that I still believe there is support for jazz. They did keep the American Jazz Masters, and I'm sure if we tried to do something of this nature, that we could get it across.
Okay.
Well, I guess what I was saying is that we have put enough weight on the NEA for the moment, and I'd like to see us go in some other directions as we try to regroup and make the NEA stronger. But we don't need to just use that as our only source. And so if we can get this in other areas, I think that would be helpful to them as well as to us. Kobe?
I just wanted to say that I hope next year we can bring Joanne Burke's documentary on Mary Lou Williams, because part of the money came from the National Endowment, right?
That's right.
And Peter worked on it, and I was fortunate enough to be able to talk to Joanne a couple of times about it too. So I hope
would you tell us a little about that? That may not be common knowledge. Tell us a little about that.
We saw the document. She showed it in the rough at the tribute we did for Mary Lou shortly before she died. Do you remember, in Town Hall? And Melba Liston was the musical director of that one. And she showed it at Town Hall, and it was rough. The difference between the finished and the rough copy is amazing. We saw it at the New York City Film Festival, Mary Lou, the documentary on Mary Lou Williams. And it's marvelous. It's marvelous. She's just herself through the whole film. Joanne captured her just as herself. She never posed or anything. She just, sometimes she looked like that and sometimes she looked like that. But she was just herself, and she talked, and she was teaching the kids and stuff. It's worth seeing. If you see it listed in any film festival, go see it. And it's really wonderful. I thought I saw it in black and white, but it was in color when I saw the finished. Yeah, it was in color. It was gorgeous.
Just to one point to add to what you're saying, and then continue, please. If any of you have organizations that want to celebrate these kinds of things, you can get these films sometimes from the person that created the film, show it at your affair or your festival or whatever for a nominal fee, and at least that helps to keep this kind of thing alive, and it would be very helpful in this case. I'm sorry.
And the other thing I wanted to answer was that, yes, Melba Liston is alive and well, writing and arranging and composing, and she travels a lot with Randy Weston. She works with him. She, does arrangements for him. And yes, she's fine. She still doesn't have full use of this hand, but she's working on the computer. So, okay, and she's in L.A. And if anyone wanted to write, I do have her address. if you want to write to her, which I'll give you later. Thank you.
Thank you, Colby.
I just can add that the Joanne Brooke film, I know for a fact, is available in New York City from Women Make Movies, and it's available for rental in 2 formats. I don't know anywhere else, but I know they have it.
What do you know what 2 formats?
Well, video and
Oh, video.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, that's
So it's available, and if you, as Dr. Taylor said, if you have any events where you can possibly show it, it's well worth getting.
The question I have has to do with her writing sacred music and Duke Ellington's writing sacred music. Would someone on the panel care to talk about Mary Lou Williams' influence on Duke Ellington? Of course, he had written Come Sunday back in '43, but she started writing full-scale sacred works before he did.
I can talk about that briefly. First of all, I had nothing to do with any production of any of Mary's sacred music. That came from her. I read someplace, Father O'Brien and Mary Lou Williams formed Mary Records to record her sacred works. That's a lie. She had done that a year and a half before I met her. And she handed me her first record from Mary Records, which included 4 sacred pieces. The night I walked in, you know, the waterfall and all that. All right. So that came directly out of her, like Billy was saying, you know, all of that stuff. The only thing I know that in the Hickory House, Mary Lou, Duke used to come to eat there. Not because Mary was playing, he liked the steaks.
right.
It was called the Hickory House because they had hickory-cured steaks, and they cooked them over logs, you know, and ice cream. And he'd come in there, and Mary gave him her record, just like the same bit, Rusty to Rusty, that type of thing. Here you go, my new record. That's all. And I don't know if there's any causal connection at all, but Martin de Porres was on that, a tune which she wrote with Ada Moore called The Devil is a Woman. Then another version of Praise the Lord, the first version which Melba Liston scored, and An Anima Christi, Soul of Christ, really funky with the bass clarinet. She gave that to Duke. A year and a half later, Duke had his first sacred concert. That's all I know.
Are any
Now,
of you...
she did not write music for concert. She wrote, those were just sacred pieces. Her first mass is for unison children, solo piano, to be done during a mass in a church.
Right.
Not to sell tickets for a sacred concert, to do music in church for free. So she has a different purpose. And then the only thing I did do, they called me about that concert at Carnegie Hall, America Magazine, a Jesuit magazine, and that's the first job I negotiated for her. We were friends first. And I said, why don't you do, she had 2 things, and I need one more. I said, why don't you do a Lord's Prayer? And she did it 4 woods, but I said, why not the Our Father? And the recording that Carlene made, solo voice, later for Mary Lou's Mass, is an extraction from that first heavy arrangement.
Once again, thank all of you. I hope you enjoy the concert tonight, and we'll see you shortly.
Woman got